Buck's first day on Daya Beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He'd been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun-kissed life was this, with nothing to do but loaf and be bored. Here he was neither peace nor rest, nor a moment's safety. All was confusion and action, and every moment life and limb were in peril. There was imperative need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. He'd never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It is true that it was a vicarious experience, else he'd have not lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store where she, in her friendly way, made advances to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf, though not half as large as she. There was no warning, only a leap like a flash, a metallic clip of teeth, and a leap out equally swift, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was a wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away. There was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in an intent and silent circle. Buck didn't comprehend their silent intentness, or the eager way in which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her antagonist, who struck again and leaped aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a peculiar fashion that tumbled her off her feet. She never regained them. This was what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yelling, and she was buried, screaming with agony, beneath a bristling mass of bodies. So sudden was it, and so unexpected, that Buck was taken aback. He saw Spitz run out his scarlet tongue in a way he had of laughing, and he saw Francois swing an axe, spring into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It didn't take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her assailants were clubbed off, but she lay there limp and lifeless in a bloody, trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces. Swart half-breed standing over her, cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that's the way. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he'd see to it he never went down. Spitz ran out his tongue and laughed again, and from that moment Buck hated him with a bitter, deathless hatred. Before he'd recovered from the shock caused by the tragic passing of Curly, he received another shock. Francois hastened him a fat arrangement of straps and buckles. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on horses at home. As he had seen horses work, he was set to work, hauling Francois on a sled to the forest that fringed the valley, returning with a load of firewood. Though his dignity was sorely hurt by thus being made a draught animal, he was too wise to rebel. He bucked down with a will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francois was stern, demanding instant obedience, and by virtue of a whip received instant obedience, while Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hind corners whenever he was in error. Spitz was the leader, likewise experienced. While he couldn't always get at Buck, he growled sharp reproof now and again, or cunningly threw his weight and traces to jerk Buck into the way he should go. Buck learned easily, and under the combined tuition of his 2 mates, Francois made remarkable progress. Ere they returned to camp, he was knew enough to stop at hoe, go ahead at mush, to swing wide on the bends, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sleds shot downhill at their heels. "Tree very good dogs," Francois told Perrault. "Dat Buck him pull like that. I teach him, quick as anything." By afternoon, Perrault, who was in a hurry to be on the trail with his dispatches, returned with 2 more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them. 2 brothers and true huskies both. Sons of one mother though they were as different as day and night. Billy's one fault was his excessive good nature, while Joe was the very opposite, sour and introspective, with a perpetual snarl and a malignant eye. Buck received them in camaraderie fashion. Dave ignored them, while Spitz proceeded to thrash first one and the other. Billy wagged his tail appeasingly, turning to run when he saw appeasement was no avail, and cried, still appeasingly, when Spitz's sharp teeth scored his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whipped around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips writhing and snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes diabolically gleaming, the incarnation of belligerent fear. So terrible was his disappearance that Spitz was forced to forego disciplining him. But to cover his own discomfort, he turned upon the inoffensive and wailing Billy and drove him to the confines of the camp. By evening, Perrault secured another dog, an old husky, long, lean, and gaunt, with a battle-scarred face and a single eye which flashed a warning of prowess that commanded respect. He was called Solix, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, expected nothing, and when he marched slowly and deliberately into their midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one peculiarity which Buck was unlucky enough to discover. He didn't like to be approached on his blind side. Of this offense Buck was unwittingly guilty, and the first knowledge he had of his indiscretion was when Solix whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone, 3 inches up and down. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their comradeship had no more trouble. His only apparent ambition, like Dave's, was to be left alone. Though, as Buck was afterward to learn, each of them possessed one another and even more vital ambition. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, illuminated by a candle, glowed warmly in the mist of the white plain, and he was, as a matter of course, entered it. Both Perrault and Francois bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils, till he recovered from his consternation and fled ignominiously into the outer cold. A chill wind was blowing that nipped him sharply, and bit with especial venom into his wounded shoulder. He lay down on the snow and attempted to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and disconsolate, he wandered about the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as another. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hair and snarled. He was learning fast, and they let him go away unmolested. Finally, an idea came to him. He'd return and see how his teammates were making out. To his astonishment, they disappeared. Again he wandered through the great camp, looking for them, and he again returned. Where were they, in the tent? No, that could not be, else he wouldn't have been driven out. Where could they possibly be? With drooping tail and shivering body, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his forelegs, and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown. But a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air ascended to the nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow, in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined placatingly, squirmed and wriggled to show his goodwill and intention. He even ventured as a bribe for peace to lick Buck's face with a warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that's the way they did it, eh? Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss and waste effort proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a trice the heat from his body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and arduous, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes till roused by the noises of the waking camp. At first he didn't know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed on him on every side, and a great surge of sueur fed through him, the fear of a wild thing for the trap. It was a token harking back through his own life to the lives of his forefathers, for he was a civilized dog, an unduly civilized dog. In his own experience, he knew no trap, and couldn't think of himself to fear it. The muscles of his whole body contracted spasmodically and instinctively, and the hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end. With a ferocious snarl, he bounded straight up into the blinding day, snow flying about him in a flashing cloud. He landed on his feet and saw the white camp spread out before him, and he knew where he was and remembered all that had passed from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he dug for himself the night before. A shout from Francois hailed his appearance. "What I say?" the dog driver cried to Perrault. "That Buck for sure lean quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government, bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9. And before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Daya Canyon. Buck was glad to be gone, and though the work was hard, he found he didn't particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team, which was communicated to him, but still more surprised by the change in Dave and Solix. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness and unconcern had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious the way work should go, and fiercely irritable with whatever by delay or confusion retarded that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being and all that they lived for, and the only thing in which they took delight. Dave was wheeler or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Sol Leeks. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file, to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposely placed between Dave and Sol Leeks so that he might receive instruction. Apt scholar that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger long in error, forcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and wise. He never nicked Buck without cause, and would never fail to nip him when he stood in need of it. As Francois's whip backed him up, Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways rather than to retaliate. Once, during a brief halt, when he got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol Leeks flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The resulting tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear thereafter, and ere the day was done, so well he had mastered his work, his mates ceased snagging him. Francois's whip snapped less frequently, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and examining them. It was a hard day's run up the canyon through Sheep Camp, past the scales and timberline, across glaciers and snowdrifts hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilkoot Divide, which stands between saltwater and the fresh guards forbiddingly, the sad and lonely north. They made good time down the chain of lakes which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into the huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the breakup of the ice in the spring. Buck made a hole in the snow and slept the sleep of an exhausted just, but all too early was routed in the cold darkness and harnessed with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, track being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at Guy Pole, sometimes exchanged places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, which knowledgeable was indispensable, for the fall ice was very thin, and there was swift water. There was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bit of fish, crawling to sleep in the snow. Buck was ravenous. Pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for the day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough, and suffered from perpetual hunger pangs. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less or were born to the life, received only a pound of fish, and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost the fastidiousness which had characterized his old life. A dainty eater, he found that his mates finished first, robbed him as his unfinished ration. There was no defending it. When he was fighting off 2 or 3, it was disappearing down the throats of the others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as they, and so greatly did hunger compel him, he was not above what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, a clever malingerer and thief, slyly steal a piece of bacon when Perrault's back was turned, he duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward blunderer who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. The first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing condition, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay or going to piece of his moral nature, a vain thing, a handicap in the ruthless struggle of existence. It was all well enough in the Southland, under a law of love and fellowship, to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland, under the law of club and fang, who took such things into account was a fool, and as much as he observed, he would fail to prosper. Not that Buck reasoned it out. He was fit, that was all, and unconsciously he had accommodated himself to a new mode of life. All the days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight. The club of the man in the red swatter had beaten into him a more fundamental primitive code. Civilized, he could have died for moral consideration, say the defense of Judge Miller's riding whip, but the completeness of his decivilization was now evidenced by an ability to flee from a defense of moral consideration to save his hide. He didn't steal for the joy of it, but the clamor of his stomach. He didn't rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly, out of respect for Club and Fang. In short, the things he done because it was easier to do them than to not do them. His development, or retrogression, was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to ordinary pain. He achieved an internal as well as external economy. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutriment, and his blood carried to the farthest reach of his body, building into the toughest, stoutest of tissue. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it heralded peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out of his teeth when it collected between his toes, and when he was thirsty and there was a thick scum of ice over the water, he'd break it by rearing and striking with stiff forelegs. His most conspicuous trait was an ability to scent the wind and forecast it a night in advance. No matter how breathless the air when he dug his nest by tree or bank, the wind that later blew inevitably found him leeward, sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again. A domesticated generation fell from him. In vague ways, he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forest and killed meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they'd stamped into the heredity of a breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had been his always. And when, on still, cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead in dust, pointed nose at star and howling through the centuries and through him. And his cadences were their cadences. His cadences were voiced, their woe into what the meaning of the stillness and cold and dark. Thus, as a token of what a puppet thing life is, the ancient song surged through him, and he came into his own again. He became because of a yellow metal found in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages didn't lap the needs of his wife and divers small cuppies of himself.